In this new world, anyone can revisit any moment of their own past as often as they like, but nothing that happened there can be changed. And the first thing is that this does not feel dramatic for very long. It settles into ordinary use. Attention learns a new movement and then keeps it. There is the now that continues by itself, and there is the earlier hours still available, still standing where it stood, not waiting exactly, because waiting suggests need, and the old moment does not need anything from the person who returns to it. That is part of what makes it strange. A door would have been simpler. A machine, too. People know how to think about objects that begin an event and end it again. But this is closer to deciding to look twice at something that has never stopped existing in the form it had when it first occurred. The oddness is not in getting there. The oddness is in learning that leaving was never final enough to deserve the word people used for it before this became normal life. So a room can be empty, and not empty in a way nobody finds worth remarking on after childhood. There are spaces arranged for return because bodies still prefer furniture, even when attention has gone elsewhere. A quiet room with one chair does enough. The chair faces no special point, because the point is not in front of it. It only needs to hold weight while the mind settles backward into some Tuesday afternoon or some short conversation near a window, or 5 seconds spent looking at nothing important at all. The scrape of the chair matters more than decoration. That small pull across the floor means preparation has begun, though what follows leaves no mark on the air around it. The body remains where it is placed. That never stopped mattering. It matters because revisiting did not free anyone from practical limits. Knees still stiffen if held too long. Tea still cools beside an unattended hand. A neck bent at a poor angle will complain later whether the mind spent those minutes in last week or 10 years ago. This keeps the whole business grounded in an almost comic way. Even with access to any prior instant of one's own life, cushions are purchased carefully, chairs are tested before sale, and entire trades exist around supporting a spine during extended attendance upon what has already happened. Humans organize everything they repeat often enough. That comes early here. Not laws first, though those come soon enough, but customs so plain they feel older than they are. Knock before entering a return room, even if its occupant cannot hear, because attention is elsewhere. Do not startle someone just after they come back. There is often a lag, while two tenses sort themselves out inside one face. Leave water within reach before any long revisit, because thirst arrives all at once when someone returns from 3 silent hours spent observing 20 minutes from years ago. The practical kindnesses appear before philosophy does. Then, philosophy comes anyway, because ordinary use does not remove the question underneath it. Ordinary use only teaches people how to live over an unanswered thing without falling through. What counts as being present? One's presence can be repeated. A moment occurs, passes, remains available, receives another visit, perhaps 50 more over a lifetime, and each return contains full attention, but no influence at all. It goes on having happened exactly once, while also being inhabited many times by someone who had supposedly already left. That double condition sits quietly inside everything else. Even memory changes shape under that pressure. Memory used to do more work than it does now. That much is obvious, even if nobody says it out loud with much ceremony. Recollection can still blur edges or sharpen them unfairly because minds remain minds. But there is less authority in saying, "I remember," when one might instead say, "I went back yesterday and checked." Whole arguments flatten under that sentence alone. Yet checking does not solve as much as people once hoped it would solve, because seeing again only proves what happened outwardly. It does not restore what was felt while living through it unawares. A cup left on a table makes this clear in a small way. It sits there with its thin crack running down from the rim, and whatever was poured into it already cooling beyond interest. And somehow that object says more about time than most official language manages to say. Heat leaves whether attended or unattended. The drink reaches room temperature without asking if anyone plans to revisit the minute when steam was still rising from its surface. Return can recover sight of warmth, but cannot put warmth back into the cup, now resting under an ordinary ceiling in an ordinary room. That seems minor until everything begins to resemble it. The past remains accessible but not renewable. This becomes one of those facts children absorb before they have words precise enough for it. Yes, yesterday's birthday can be visited again. No, cake eaten there will not feed hunger here. Yes, an old laugh may be heard another 100 times. No, hearing it again will not make today's silence less silent when attention returns forward again into current hours with their unpaid bills and damp laundry and cups gone cold beside chairs made for waiting bodies. There is comfort in that limit. Without it, people might have disappeared into correction fever forever, clawing at every misplaced phrase and every wrong turn taken in rain outside some station years earlier. Since nothing can be altered, obsession loses one of its sharpest tools, even if desire remains intact for a while longer than dignity prefers to admit. One may go back and watch oneself choose badly with increasing accuracy. One may study tone of voice down to single syllables. One may linger over pauses until they become almost visible. Things between sentences. Yet none of this grants revision rights over reality itself. So eventually, another use emerges. Not fixing. Not even understanding most of the time, since understanding tends to promise more closure than life usually supplies here or anywhere else people have ever tried arranging themselves into meaning inside time's habits. It becomes attendance instead, sitting with what occurred until impatience strains off and detail begins to separate itself from invention. The exact angle of a shoulder near a doorway, once thought accusatory, but perhaps merely tired. 4 seconds of hesitation mistaken for certainty during years of retelling. The small clink as ceramic meets wood, marking an end nobody recognized fully while living through its first arrival. A sound set down once can be heard many times. And then there is another strangeness beneath that one. Repeated witness changes nothing in the event itself, but certainly changes the witness beyond recovery from whatever version existed during first passage through that same minute. Someone returns older than before to observe someone younger, who is also somehow still oneself, without sharing one's later knowledge, except as spectacle viewed from outside consequence, now fixed beyond repair, or rescue, or excuse. It becomes hard not to ask where exactly the present resides, when attention keeps taking up seats in places already vacated by history, yet never closed against re-entry. No answer settles for long. Perhaps that is why dedicated rooms stay plain when they are built well. One chair heavy enough not to shift unexpectedly under resting weight, maybe a side table broad enough for water or notes never consulted afterward. Perhaps that cracked cup left too long between uses, because even neglected objects gather relevance here if they testify quietly enough about duration passing regardless of who is watching. Nothing needs ornament, where time itself has become reusable material, handled every day without ever becoming simple. And after all this has become routine, after forms are printed for workplaces explaining delayed responses due to scheduled revisits, and after families learn which silences mean absence backward rather than offense forward, and after shops begin selling better headrests at prices inflated by inevitability rather than quality, there remains this stubborn fact: returning does not erase departure. The earlier hour goes on, complete without assistance. The current hour goes on too. What kind of presence belongs to someone standing again inside a moment that continued perfectly well after being left behind? That is why the cup keeps drawing the eye. Not because it is important in any official way, and not because anyone would preserve it behind glass, but because it has done the ordinary work of holding warmth and then failing to keep it. The rim is chipped in one place where the glaze has gone dull around the break, and a hairline split runs downward far enough to be noticed only after looking twice. Tea or coffee once stood hot inside it, and now there is only that faint stain near the bottom where liquid cooled against ceramic and then was gone. Revisiting does nothing for temperature. Heat leaves on schedule. A return gaze finds only what remained when warmth had already decided to stop being part of the arrangement. That seems small until it does not. Memory often flatters a moment by keeping only its center, but going back restores edges that memory never bothered with. The ring left under the cup because nobody used a coaster that day, a spoon mark near the handle. The slight tackiness of dried sugar where a drop ran down and was missed during wiping. The mind likes to say it remembers a conversation or an afternoon, yet what comes back first, when attention settles into an earlier minute again, may be this cracked vessel sitting off to one side, doing nothing except proving that time included more than whatever feeling later claimed ownership of it. And then there is the odd pressure of seeing an object continue without needing witness at all. A cup on a table does not care whether it is being revisited. It sat there once among sounds already spent. It sits there again for anyone returning. In neither case does it alter itself out of courtesy. That indifference may be one reason these small things matter so much here. They are steady in a world where attention can loop backward as often as patience allows. People become complicated around their own pasts very quickly. Objects do not. Ceramic cools. A crack remains a crack. Stain darkens if ignored long enough. Nobody expects consolation from crockery, which makes its honesty unusually useful. Sometimes, that honesty reaches further than memory can tolerate comfortably. There are afternoons recalled for years as urgent, which turn out, upon return, to have contained long stretches of waiting, beside untouched cups gone nearly cold before any decisive sentence arrived. There are meetings remembered as brief that reveal themselves full of pauses while steam thinned above porcelain and disappeared one thread at a time. The body had lived through those gaps once without marking them properly. Later recollection cut them away out of impatience. Revisiting puts them back with no interest in narrative efficiency. That correction feels tender rather than cruel most days. The surface of the table matters too, which is easy to forget until attention lands there long enough to notice how many endings wood can receive without comment, one soft contact after another, each set down making its own small report against grain, already marked by years of similar reports. The little clink at contact is not dramatic. It barely qualifies as an event, even while happening. Yet repeated hearing gives it weight, because such sounds divide time cleanly, without asking permission from thought. Something was held up off the table, and then was no longer held up off the table. A pause concluded there. It raises another difficulty about returning, that never quite goes away, when a moment has already completed itself so fully without needing renewed attendance. What exactly is present when attention arrives late and stays? The cup does not resume being hot, merely because someone has come back, willing at last to notice how fast heat left it. In ordinary rooms, this becomes plain very quickly. No machine hum announces transit, no theatrical sign marks passage from current hour into prior one. Instead, there is this almost embarrassing continuity in which familiar objects remain faithful to their positions, while meaning shifts around them under second sight or 10th sight or 50th, if someone has decided repetition counts as devotion rather than stubbornness. A chair faces where it always faced. The side table bears what was put upon it then, or what had been left before then by some earlier use. Nobody now recalls clearly except through records and habits of maintenance. Even neglect acquires definition under repeated witness. A neglected cup tells several things at once without trying very hard. First use, later abandonment, eventual noticing by someone who came back more patient than whoever first sat near it, and managed to be during live passage through that same stretch of minutes. The chip on its lip might have existed already during first encounter, or might belong to some later handling beyond that particular scene. Sometimes certainty about sequence fails, even when direct revisit should seem able to settle everything neatly. This is another quiet absurdity here. Access does not guarantee clarity if nobody thought at the time to look closely enough at what later becomes interesting. So people learn strange forms of respect toward details they cannot predict, needing someday. Not reverence, exactly. More caution with dismissal. Any small thing may prove stubborn enough to survive multiple returns, and therefore gain authority over stories told afterward about what mattered and what did not matter at all. It changes furniture slightly in places built for revisiting, often enough to need practical design, rather than sentiment about impossible acts made routine through repetition. Tables tend toward stability over elegance, because wobble becomes intolerable when attention wants stillness, more than beauty. Chairs are weighted well because physical distraction feels out of place beside concentrated return. Cups used in these rooms are thick-walled, less from aesthetic preference than from institutional knowledge, that people linger longer around cooled drinks when they have gone elsewhere in time, while remaining seated here in body, among plain walls and manageable quiet. There is bureaucracy hiding even inside ceramics, if one looks long enough. Cafes learned this early without admitting philosophy had anything to do with their floor plans or inventory choices. One sees tables meant for one person facing an empty opposite chair, often enough that eventually management begins charging less for occupancy. Measured by space taken now and more for duration measured by divided attention. Across tenses, nobody can invoice honestly without sounding ridiculous. On paper receipts kept for tax purposes anyway, because impossible customs still require accounting offices before they become respectable commerce. The busiest seats are sometimes those appearing unused. Staff know better than appearances suggest. A cooling drink occupies real time whether company exists in this minute or another one entirely. And still the simplest version remains truest. Ceramic holds heat poorly against duration. No matter how faithfully someone returns to watch earlier hands circle its side, or earlier mouths pause above, rising steam before saying whatever was said next, forever unchanged now, except by who comes back. Ready finally to hear tone correctly, instead of merely remembering intention afterward. A vessel can keep shape while losing content. Perhaps moments do something close to that. Or perhaps that is too neat, and neatness usually lies where time is concerned here. Better just stay with what can be touched mentally, even when untouched. Physically, now, roughness at the chipped edge catching light differently from glazed parts nearby, faint discoloration where liquid sat longest, a thin line descending from rim toward base with a seriousness out of proportion to its size, because cracks always look like records even when they mean nothing, beyond stress, answered by material limits sometime between, uses no witness happen to be watching, live or later. Not every mark carries revelation. Some marks are simply marks. That also matters. If something ordinary can sit through several versions of scrutiny without yielding any grand secret, then perhaps revisiting does not exist chiefly for discovery after all. Perhaps much of it is learning how little drama most moments contained outside memory's editing habits, how often life consisted of waiting beside cooling drinks and unfinished thoughts, while nothing announced itself as permanent, until permanence had already happened quietly in passing. Then again, permanence here behaves strangely if return remains available forever within personal reach, but revision remains barred absolutely at every point touched again. What kind of leaving survives unlimited re-entry? How many departures remain complete once attendants can keep arriving after them? The answer does not settle into the cup either way. It simply sits there with its thin fracture and dulled rim, holding nothing now, still part of whatever was once present, and still refusing help with deciding what presence means, after absence has already done its work once perfectly well on its own. That refusal may be why manners grew so quickly around revisiting. If a thing cannot be changed, attention becomes the only force left, and attention is exactly what people do not know how to leave unregulated for long. There are printed cards about it now, thin paper, cheap ink, corners bent from pockets and waiting rooms. The language is careful, in the way official language always becomes careful when it has to govern something impossible without sounding embarrassed by itself. Observe without intrusion. Do not attempt contact. Limit duration in shared intervals when others hold standing access. It is calm on the page, almost domestic. A set of table rules for being absent correctly. That is one of the stranger achievements here. Humans learned how to make etiquette out of non-interference. The old fear was that going back would tempt interference at every turn, that people would spend their lives lunging toward earlier doors and earlier words, reaching to stop what already happened from happening. But the prohibition does not need moral strength because reality enforces it more cleanly than any law could. Nothing yields. Nothing takes correction. So the real problem turned out to be posture, gaze, duration, permission, all the small social mechanics that grow around helplessness, once helplessness becomes common enough to require office hours. A classroom somewhere had to teach this first in plain speech. Keep still. Do not hover too near a former self or anyone beside them. Do not return so often to another person's unguarded hour that presence becomes a kind of pressure, even if no one there can feel it then. That last part sounds absurd until paperwork appears beside it, and then absurdity hardens into policy with stamps and renewal dates and appeals filed in duplicate, because someone remained too long near an argument from 8 years ago, and the other party objected after learning how often it had been revisited under family access provisions. Nobody fully reads before signing. Forms make everything look settled. A cabinet drawer closes with the same dull final sound, whether it contains tax records or petitions for access to a Thursday afternoon in late autumn. There are labels for recurring disputes, domestic conversation access, shared meal review rights, minor child memory attendance until age of release. Even grief had to be translated into categories before offices could process demand without drowning in exceptional cases claimed by everyone as unique and therefore deserving immediate accommodation ahead of queue order already posted behind glass. It is never called staring in official language, though that is often what the rules are trying to manage. Not looking exactly, because looking is unavoidable here, but staying fixed upon someone who once believed themselves alone inside an ordinary minute, and later learns that minute has become occupied repeatedly by eyes they did not invite at the time. Because invitation was impossible then, and only became discussable afterward, through channels designed by clerks who have somehow made privacy retroactive by consent form. The calmest advice tends to be the most severe. Do not linger where affection has ended badly. Do not revisit anger while still feeding it elsewhere in current life. Those sentences appear on walls now and then, beside water dispensers and stackable chairs with metal legs that scrape across tile when moved for orientation sessions. No one enjoys attending yet. Nearly everyone does eventually. There is money in instruction, naturally. A person can pay for a short course on respectful witnessing and receive a certificate embossed with silver lines declaring competence in temporal conduct within shared personal histories up to intermediate complexity levels. The certificate means almost nothing materially, unless a court request arises or archive privileges expand under contested circumstances. But people frame them anyway. Because humans enjoy credentials most when credentials certify restraint rather than skill. Restraint suggests character while requiring only attendance fees and 2 evenings free next month. And still some guidance is useful, because ordinary politeness breaks at strange angles here. It was once enough merely not to interrupt conversation taking place before one's eyes. Now there are conversations one has already interrupted, by thinking about them too aggressively years later, even though nothing inside them changed at all, except the ownership of attention around them afterward. What does one owe those earlier versions of others who spoke carelessly under conditions they assumed would vanish into memory instead of remaining available for repeated inspection? The question stays awkward precisely because no harm occurs inside the preserved moment itself, while something close to harm may gather outside it over time. That gap created an industry of permission slips. Not broad permissions either, narrow ones, itemized down to date ranges and relation type, signed with boxes initialed at each margin, so nobody can claim they misunderstood whether kitchen conversations counted as private reflections when another household member stood nearby but said nothing audible on record, according to revisit logs reviewed later during mediation proceedings, conducted under fluorescent light by officials whose whole profession depends on deciding which parts of yesterday remain ethically visitable tomorrow. One begins to notice how much civilization depends on deciding when observation becomes trespass. A bridge at a certain hour may belong legally only to public passage, yet socially also belong a little to whoever crossed it first, believing no audience would ever gather there except weather and traffic noise below. Then years pass, and requests accumulate from relatives, former lovers, legal representatives managing estates of memory rights, now transferable under limited conditions if notarized correctly before death or incapacity, or simple disinterest renders old moments administratively dormant, but never fully ownerless. because apparently even abandoned time attracts custodians eventually. There are cues for solitude now. That sentence should sound impossible longer than it does, but repetition makes anything bureaucratic feel earned after a while. A numbered ticket can be taken while waiting for access to sit again near one's own silence from 17 years earlier, or near somebody else's if mutual signatures remain valid and no conflicting claim has priority due to pending review status marked amber on public terminals, refreshed every 10 minutes whether anyone watches them or not. The humor never quite leaves this system, though nobody laughs loudly inside those buildings because everyone there wants something tender handled efficiently. Still, the absurd details persist. Laminated notices reminding visitors not to consume hot drinks over active timestamp consoles, vending machines selling mints beside counters where staff verify identity against photographs taken long after requested moments occurred. Polite disputes over whether noon was entered correctly when daylight saving adjustments altered local clocks but not lived. Sequence. A lost and found box containing scarves forgotten by people preoccupied with returning elsewhere. Mentally, while remaining required physically present for authorization checks completed between 900 and 4,000 treks. Completed between 900 and 4. Even miracles get lunch breaks. Perhaps especially miracles, once they become municipal responsibilities instead of revelations. What else could happen? Anything repeated enough ends up behind glass with reception hours posted nearby. Yet beneath all that filing, there remains something difficult that forms cannot touch cleanly. Being unseen does not mean being neutral just because causation stays locked shut. Attention accumulates around certain moments. Anyway, families know which dinner keeps drawing returns, though no statute mentions emotional congestion. Thresholds, former partners can sense from paperwork patterns which apology keeps being watched again, even if content remains inaccessible without further approval, rarely granted absent compelling reason, stated clearly within allotted space, provided below line 14. So classes instruct posture again, where to stand within a remembered room. How far from an earlier chair counts as courteous distance. How long silence remains observant before becoming possessive in spirit, if not effect. No machine measures this exactly. Someone always has to decide badly, case by case. That may be why small objects start feeling reliable beside all this human interpretation. A ceramic cup says less than policy does. Its rim carries a nick. Its side bears that narrow fault line descending toward the base. Nobody needs legal training to understand that wear exists without accusation. The cup cooled once. It would cool again every single time attendants returned around it. No witness improves its temperature by caring harder. There is relief in that limit. Instruction manuals sometimes include a sentence meant kindly. You do not need to do anything on return, except attend responsibly within approved boundaries already established by circumstance and law. It sounds comforting until read twice. Then another meaning settles underneath. There is nothing available but watching well or badly. Action has been removed, so completely that ethics must shrink down into angle of regard, length of stay, whether consent was asked before making someone's ordinary Tuesday, durable through repeated visitation. They never imagined granting retroactively after trust changed shape years later, outside the preserved scene itself. And then, where does presence sit if attendance can arrive after departure has finished? Not bodily, perhaps. Bodies stay obediently current enough for administration purposes. But something undeniably gathers at old tables and old pauses under these rules, even while remaining unable to press upon them from within their own time. That seems minor, until one notices whole institutions built around managing gatherings that cannot intervene. yet still somehow matter enough to require badges clipped neatly above breast pockets during orientation sessions about discretion, delivered every Monday morning except civic holidays, noted on the same board as fire drill procedures and copier repair requests awaiting parts since April 12th last year, according to a handwritten note still taped near the reception desk. So much order around powerlessness, so much procedure around simply coming back and keeping hands off what was always going to happen exactly once, however many times it is seen afterward. And perhaps that is fairer than any grander arrangement would have been. Still, the question remains, off to one side of every rule book, when a moment goes on perfectly well without needing renewed company from those who left it behind, what sort of company arrives there anyway? A watched conversation does not become two conversations. That seems obvious at first. Words were spoken once. A hand rested on the table once. The small pause before a reply happened once and only once, complete in itself, not waiting for later attendance to certify it. And yet the obvious answer keeps slipping, because the moment afterward is no longer alone. It has its own sealed interior, yes, but it also acquires an exterior life made of returns, permissions, denials, anniversaries noted privately, forms stamped for access to 23 minutes on a wet Thursday that meant very little while it was being lived, and much more after. That is where the mind catches. If a thing can be entered again without being altered, then what exactly remains singular about it? Not its content, perhaps. Content stays fixed enough. The sentence said, then is still the sentence. Said then. The chair leg still marks the floor in the same place. A cup left near an elbow cools at the same patient rate, whether one witness comes back or 40 do under separate approvals spread across years. But singularity may not belong only to content. It may belong to exhaustion, to a moment having spent itself and gone beyond recall, except as memory's rough copy. Remove that exhaustion, and something changes even if nothing inside the scene does. A room can finish and still keep receiving company afterward. That is strange. The oddness sits in ordinary phrases people use without hearing them fully. A meeting is over. Lunch ended there. That bridge crossing happened years ago. Such sentences carry a confidence about completion that daily life requires in order to move at all. Otherwise, nothing would leave its place properly, and every goodbye would need legal clarification attached beneath it in smaller print. But here, completion means only that no further action can occur within the event itself. It does not mean attention has stopped arriving there, or that presence has ceased collecting around what already occurred. So perhaps a moment is single from inside and layered from outside. Inside it knows nothing of later revisits because it cannot know. Ignorance is part of its integrity. Outside it becomes durable in a way no previous age intended, moments to be durable, subject not to change, but to repeated occupancy by people whose relation to it keeps shifting long after the original feeling passed through their bodies and left them older elsewhere. That durability produces careful language in offices. Files avoid words such as important, unless statute demands them, because importance breeds argument quickly when access slots are scarce, or consent records incomplete, or siblings request overlapping review rights. For one afternoon, nobody considered preserving when it was simply happening, around soup bowls and unpaid bills on a counter beside mail, addressed incorrectly for the third month running. So clerks prefer terms such as recurrent interest or sustained personal relevance, which sound clean until placed next to what they actually govern. Human beings returning again and again to some narrow strip of lived time, because they cannot quite settle what was present there while they were busy being inside it. The absurdity is mild but constant. There are time-stamped disputes over pauses now. There are guidelines distinguishing educational revisitation from relational revisitation, when both concern exactly 9 seconds between a question and an answer, recorded nowhere except in those who were there, and those later admitted under proper authorization codes, renewed every fiscal year, unless waived under compassionate review provisions revised on August 3rd, after public consultation produced 72 pages of comments about fairness, dignity, queue length, observer fatigue, retrospective consent standards, minors aging into authority over scenes first witnessed before they could spell their own surnames correctly on school forms, now archived with charming seriousness behind acid-free sleeves. All this around silence. And silence may be where repetition feels most intrusive, even though intrusion changes nothing material within the preserved interval itself. Spoken words stand up well under return, because words expect ears. They were built for reception, whether immediate or delayed by memory or recording or retelling. Over weak tea gone cold on a saucer marked with an old brown ring, no wiping ever removed, entirely from varnish worn thin at one edge of the table. Silence is different. Silence belongs more completely to those inside it at first occurrence. To revisit another person's quiet thought space without permission may obey physics perfectly while failing manners by several inches. Which suggests attention has weight, even when causation does not. Not physical weight, of course. No old floorboard dips further because 10 future visits stood above one remembered breakfast argument about train times or rent, or whether anyone had fed the cat whose dish sat empty beside yesterday's newspaper folded open to weather that had already happened by every measure available except this particular one, where happening remains accessible after ending so long as procedure permits, return within licensed bounds, clearly posted near exits along with penalties for unauthorized overlap, during protected private intervals between 18,000 and 22,000 local time, unless all directly affected parties have signed supplemental waivers witnessed by approved officers. Still, something bears down. A repeated look can thin a thing out in social life, even if the underlying fact refuses to cooperate with social feeling. Faces prove this easily enough in ordinary current time. Stare too long at anyone across a cafe table, and meaning accumulates whether intended or not, though muscles remain untouched and air undisturbed between watcher and watched, until someone reaches for payment, slips tucked beneath salt shakers chipped white at their corners from years of cleaning against hard surfaces done too fast, before opening hour begins again. Tomorrow morning, according to schedule. Taped crookedly near the till with yesterday's amended rota, initialed twice where names were crossed out, then restored after appeals. Past moments are no better protected from significance, merely because they cannot notice being looked at. This may be why some people speak of wearing out an afternoon without meaning literal erosion of event substance, only exhaustion in themselves produced by too much return, applied too narrowly until memory loses proportion around that chosen patch of time, and everything nearby starts serving merely as corridor toward it. Door handle first seen before entering, scrape of chair legs, spoon left unwashed beside sink, final clink when crockery met wood and marked an end. Nobody recognized as enduring enough to revisit later, under numbered authorization stamped lower right by office seal, faded slightly where ink ran low. Last quarter. Attention can abrade its owner, if not its object. That distinction matters more than regulations admit publicly. Because institutions prefer measurable harms. They know how to count interference attempts prevented per annum. They know how many unauthorized overlaps occurred during holiday periods. They know average wait times for familial petitions versus academic requests. But how should any office record gradual distortion caused by prolonged attendance upon what will never answer back differently no matter how often approached? There is no form field for emotional narrowing due to surplus certainty about one fixed exchange revisited beyond usefulness, despite advisory pamphlets recommending interval spacing between returns sufficient for prospective recovery, whenever practicable given demand levels, and staffing constraints currently under review, pending budget approval next session. So each person decides privately when repetition becomes less like understanding and more like polishing glass already transparent enough. No machine flashes red at that threshold. No clerk leans across a counter kindly enough to say, "This hour has had enough of being asked for." The system cannot forbid devotion, just because devotion sometimes hardens into habit, stripped clean of discovery. It can only organize access windows and remind applicants that observation rights do not imply therapeutic benefit guaranteed under any public scheme presently funded. Yet some moments do seem changed by being known too well, though changed only in relation rather than fact. That difference sounds minor until held still a while, beside actual objects that survive use without commentary attached to them. The cracked drinking vessel left on a tabletop does not become less itself because eyes return toward it through different years. Porcelain keeps its narrow line descending from lip toward body, regardless of who studies whether that flaw existed during first use or appeared later between one washing and another, stored out of sight. Above shoulder height among plates with faint knife marks crossing their glaze like records. Nobody filed properly because dishes are spared. Administration until time enters them through us instead. The cup remains exact. The looking does not remain exact at all. Perhaps that is why fixed events invite such uneven treatment from those who revisit them. Some go back once after decades and find enough there. Some circle 12 seconds for months because one inflection will not stop opening new meanings against current knowledge unavailable during original speech. Some avoid returning altogether out of courtesy toward former selves who managed without supervision at the time. And some mistake access for obligation, which happens whenever humans receive repeatable contact with anything valuable. Soon enough, restraint gets praised publicly, while persistence acquires loyalty points quietly through subscription tiers disguised as administrative convenience packages available monthly with reduced filing fees after identity verification complete. Even impossibility earns premium service if stable demand appears often enough. Then again, maybe the layering lies less in the moment than in whoever approaches it, carrying fresh years into old rooms, mentally, if not materially present, there among settled details, unchanged beyond all appeal, curtain half drawn, receipt tucked under sugar jar, chair angled away from table farther than neatness would suggest, warmth gone from whatever sat waiting in ceramic before conversation drifted elsewhere, leaving residue high along inner wall where liquid level had stood briefly, then dropped below stain line, now dry forever within scene, yet still plain whenever attendance returns close enough legally speaking, but never close enough actually to enter consequence again. What receives added thickness may simply be perception, arriving laden each time with later regret, relief, tenderness, none of it available on-site originally, in finished tense, now reopened only observationally. Then what counts as being there at all, if being there can happen after leaving has already done its work? The question keeps refusing simplification, because presence usually means participation, even when slight, breathing shared air in current time, bearing risk of saying wrong things irretrievably forward into lives still unsettled ahead minutes later than now, knows them to be during revisit conditions, safely stripped of hazard, except emotional self-exposure. Undertaken voluntarily within posted limits near archival reading rooms, furnished with chairs designed less for comfort than duration management, according to procurement notes. Anyone can request, though few bother, since discomfort rarely leaves paper trails dramatic enough for committee attention, unless upholstery seams fail visibly during inspections, scheduled biannually each March and September, excluding closures announced beforehand online when systems undergo maintenance overnight, starting 23. Return gives nearness without stake inside outcome. It offers company after necessity has ended. Whether that is consolation or trespass seems unstable case by case, and probably always will. A single exchange stays single somehow, and also does not stay single at all, once history learns how to sit beside itself quietly enough not to interfere. That double condition is just part of ordinary thinking here, whenever old hours remain available behind closed eyes, better regulated than dreams, yet stranger than memory was ever meant to be. Before procedure gave longing appointment times and taught patients how many digits fit neatly across top margins, while somewhere unchanged an earlier room goes on, containing exactly what it contained without help: wood grain under cooling crockery, dust along baseboard missed repeatedly by conscientious cleaning schedules, space around a chair prepared, once, then occupied. Once, however many later absences lean back into view, trying carefully not to make ownership claims over what continues, perfectly well without them, even while receiving their gaze again. That dryness matters more than it first seems to. A cup can be visited again and again, but the tea does not stay warm out of courtesy. The line in the ceramic keeps drawing attention because it looks recent, even when it is old, and old, even when it is recent. A thin split from rim to side has that quality. It suggests an event, some small strain, a tap against a sink edge, a heat change too quick for the glaze, yet under revisiting conditions even that plain story loosens. If the vessel appears unbroken in one return and marked in another, the mind reaches at once for sequence, but sequence is exactly what gets muddled when access no longer depends on waiting for time to pass only once in one direction. The crack may have come later than the drinking first attended there. It may have been present all along and simply unnoticed, because attention was spent elsewhere, where living usually spends it, on words being answered, on whether to stay 5 minutes more, on nothing remarkable at all. That is one quiet effect here. Ordinary objects receive delayed importance. A chair leg leaves a pale arc on the floor, where it has been dragged back many times over years that are still available separately. The scrape belongs to use in the ordinary sense, but revisiting adds another kind of wear that no carpenter can measure. Not physical damage. Something closer to emphasis. The same seat acquires density and thought because it has held more than one attendance by the same life, without ever holding those attendances together materially. Procurement departments replace chairs according to wobble and split joints. Nobody files maintenance requests for symbolic burden. Still, some rooms get spoken of as heavy rooms, though scales would disagree completely. The cup sits there with its flaw, doing very little, which is how most evidence behaves. Nothing about it announces temporal complexity. It just rests on wood, with a faint ring beneath where moisture once gathered, before drying away long ago in every relevant sense, except availability. And then there is the stranger possibility that revisited things do not become heavier at all. Perhaps repeated return thins them by familiarity until what first had edges becomes smooth through observation alone. Memory already does this in its own way. It rounds corners, fills gaps badly, puts confidence where details should be missing. Going back was supposed to correct that, by restoring exactness. But exactness seen too often begins to flatten into expectation. Surprise drains out. Pain made blunt. Tenderness may settle into habit. Eventually, even precision can become generic, if encountered enough times under safe conditions where nothing further can be lost except freshness itself. That may be why some guidelines advise spacing between returns to personally significant intervals, despite no technical need for delay. Not moral guidance exactly. More custodial than moral, as though moments were objects whose surfaces could somehow suffer from overhandling by sight alone. The absurdity is mild and therefore durable. There are pamphlets about responsible revisitation written in tones borrowed from museum signage and public health notices, both at once. Limit duration if emotional saturation reduces observational clarity. Avoid clustering multiple returns around unresolved interpersonal exchanges during periods of impaired sleep. Note any drift toward compulsive verification behavior. Before requesting expanded personal access windows beyond standard allocation bands. Unless therapeutic exemption applies under certified review panels. Meeting alternate Thursdays, except holidays or system outages, posted 72 hours prior whenever possible. Though unforeseen disruptions remain regrettably common due to volume fluctuations near anniversary dates. Everyone pretends not to track competitively while tracking them very closely indeed. Even so, no pamphlet can say what repeated presence does to a finished hour, because finished hours do not report discomfort formally. They cannot object or consent anew, or indicate fatigue under scrutiny. That leaves people studying residue instead. The dry crescent inside a mug where liquid stood once higher than now visible during return permissions granted years later. The spoon mark faint against glaze, sugar grains stuck near the base after stirring imperfectly done and never corrected, because correction belonged to no one's concern at the time, and belongs even less now, when all practical stakes are gone. But visual facts remain available indefinitely within policy limits. Subject always to cue pressure around culturally notable dates and privately important afternoons, whose significance would look ridiculous if written plainly on forms, yet must be summarized, somehow inside boxes too small for actual reasons. Some objects begin carrying two histories at once, what happened with them then, and what has happened since, through later noticing only. That distinction sounds stable, until looked at closely enough to fail. Because what counts as history for a thing so modest as a cup left cooling? Is it only contact in active time, lip against rim, hand around handle, table receiving weight with one small clink at rest? Or do subsequent returns become part of its lived record too, despite changing nothing material whatsoever? If 50 later visits pause over that hairline fracture and wonder whether it existed before goodbye, was said elsewhere nearby, without ceremony, has anything accrued besides interpretation? Interpretation matters more than people admit publicly while building institutions entirely devoted to managing its consequences discreetly behind stamped counters and password resets. A room meant for private returns often contains almost nothing worth naming, except what cannot help being noticed after long looking, dust along molding, fabric worn shiny on chair arms, a coaster printed with an old cafe logo, half hidden under crockery set down slightly off-center, so that one chipped edge catches light differently from intact glaze beside it. Sparse rooms make thought louder. They also make tiny changes impossible not to inventory across repeated attendance, until restraint becomes less spiritual virtue than simple self-defense against turning every revisit into inspection work, performed unpaid for archives already charging, access surcharges during peak demand, windows justified annually through reports full of phrases such as user load balancing and continuity assurance measures, accepted by everyone, because alternatives sound worse. There is something almost comic in paying extra, not for alteration or rescue, but for another look at what will refuse improvement consistently, no matter how sincere the application statement attached below signature lines. Still, people pay. Often, repeatedly. Perhaps because returning offers contact, stripped down past usefulness into bare acknowledgement. The drink cooled whether anyone came back or not. The crack either spread or had always been there unnoticed. None of this asks action anymore. There is relief in that sometimes. Not always comfort, exactly, but relief from bargaining with reality after reality has closed negotiations permanently while leaving viewing rights open under terms revised each fiscal year by committees who have never managed to make eternity fit cleanly inside office software. Built originally for conference room reservations, then patched forward beyond dignity into civic necessity with only minor interface improvements. Promised next quarter pending vendor response timelines currently under review. And yet, attention itself is never neutral, simply because hands are tied behind protocol. To watch again is still an act, however passive regulations prefer to call it on paper. Silence counts. So the little fracture running downward matters partly because it asks whether where belongs only to matter, or also to notice directed back upon matter repeatedly across distance. No ruler measures well. A cup ages through heat cycles, washing, stored shelves knocked carelessly, perhaps once too hard against another cup beside it, among many nearly identical forms stacked after closing hours. Nobody remembers specifically now, unless they choose later access routes, narrow enough to check which shelf held which row under fluorescent light, humming overhead exactly as recorded by no instrument except persistence itself, disguised as curiosity. Then another question opens behind that one, almost immediately. When returning becomes common enough to feel routine, how much looking turns a past moment into something handled rather than merely recalled? No clean answer stays put long enough worth trusting, fully. The ceramic remains cracked, either way. The table remains marked where cups have rested before being forgotten, briefly or forever, depending on paperwork definitions. More than feeling ever agreed was reasonable. And perhaps this is why some intervals are better met lightly, even when unlimited entry exists. Technically speaking, within personal rights frameworks, defended fiercely in court opinions, dense enough to cure insomnia without settling anything human underneath them, because abundance changes appetite. Strangely, because certainty can become abrasive when taken daily. Because there are moments best approached without trying to drain them dry through perfect reattendance, simply because access allows it now, where once memory had mercy enough to blur edges naturally after departure, did its ordinary work. What differs between remembering poorly and going back exactly? One gives absence softened by error. The other gives fact without remedy. Neither restores participation. So the cup cools past retrieval and keeps its narrow scar, whether seen once or 50 times from different years, leaning toward the same tabletop, still bearing its faint ring stain beneath settled air, unchanged by interest alone. And somewhere inside that plain persistence sits the harder thought that keeps returning with it. After leaving has already made itself true beyond appeal, what kind of presence can still honestly be claimed there at all? Which is how the archive enters the thought almost by itself, because once attention becomes something people can schedule, somebody has to keep the schedule. A room with cabinets follows naturally from that. Then more rooms. Then a numbering system that begins modestly and ends in colored tabs, stamped approvals, quiet disputes over overlap windows, and a notice near the desk explaining that access to another person's Tuesday at 4:10 requires consent, unless the law has already made an exception in language so careful it sounds embarrassed by its own existence. The forms are always plainer than the thing they govern. That seems constant here. A slip of paper asks for date, hour, duration requested, relation to event, declared purpose if external review is sought, and whether prior attendance has occurred under any earlier filing number, still active in the system. There is something almost sweet in that last line. Prior attendance. As though sitting again beside what has already happened were no stranger than booking a municipal hall twice in one season. Of course, people learn the vocabulary quickly. They know the difference between private return and shared witness status. They know which office handles contested family intervals and which one deals only with commercial licensing of public moments already released for educational or commemorative use. They know there are penalties for unauthorized clustering around high-demand afternoons, because even where nothing can be altered, congestion still matters. Too many returns aimed at one narrow slice of time create administrative strain first and philosophical irritation after that. The irritation is harder to record, so only the strain appears on official memos. That is just how it is here. A past moment cannot be damaged by being revisited in any simple physical sense. It does not wear under hands because there are no hands on it. And yet institutions behave as if overuse must mean something measurable, because institutions become nervous around abundance without limits. If everyone may go back as often as desired, within personal scope, then desire itself becomes the problem to regulate, not action, but frequency, not interference, but accumulation, not harm exactly, but density of regard directed at one fixed point, until clerks begin speaking quietly about capacity management for events whose capacity was once assumed infinite. There are waiting areas for this. Not because time itself makes anyone stand in line before allowing passage back, but because records do. The bench outside Processing B has grooves worn shallow along its front edge where fingers have rested, while papers were checked against older papers confirming rights established by earlier papers, filed when digital systems failed during the migration year of 2031, and everything had to be reconciled by hand, from printouts curling at their corners. Inside gray boxes stacked too high against a wall, nobody painted after water stains spread near the ceiling. It would be funny if it were not so ordinary. Perhaps it is funny because it is ordinary. Human beings will queue for anything repeated enough times to require fairness language. That includes weather permits in some places, and certainly includes access windows into what one has already lived through once without needing an appointment. Then, the first experience arrives free of stamps and passwords, Every later return may involve identity verification, robust enough to suggest suspicion toward memory itself. Name spelled correctly. Birth record matched. Continuity affidavit signed where required. Fee waived or fee assessed, depending on category code entered 3 screens earlier by someone whose lunch break began before finishing the field marked emotional relevance. Even that phrase exists now in some offices, emotional relevance. There are guidelines advising staff not to ask for more detail than necessary, while still obtaining sufficient grounds for priority review when multiple parties request supervised witness status over connected intervals involving divorce proceedings, inheritance disputes, artistic estates, or allegations of misrepresentation, later elevated beyond personal grievance into civil interest. So a clerk may need to determine whether longing counts as administrative urgency if phrased carefully enough. By counsel on embossed paper sent before noon. Thursday, except on regional holidays, observed differently across jurisdictions whose calendars never fully aligned after cross-border. Revisit treaty standardized admissibility, but not office culture. And all this around moments that proceed perfectly well without supervision from those who come late. The absurd part is not only that bureaucracy formed around revisiting, bureaucracy forms around rainwater, if enough roofs depend on it. The sharper absurdity lies in how politely everyone pretends this paperwork concerns order alone, when much of it concerns permission to look where feeling still catches on old edges. One asks formally to attend what was once simply endured or enjoyed or missed through distraction at the time, because attention had other tasks then, and only later decided this was important after all. A small ceramic cup might sit listed on an inventory attachment if property context matters for authentication of place, table item present at left side of frame area, white glaze with hairline split descending from rim, approximately 2 centimeters before branching faintly near midpoint. Even objects become clerical witnesses when memory enters administration deeply enough. Somebody typed that description somewhere because somebody else needed certainty about which afternoon was meant among many afternoons, containing nearly identical tables and nearly identical cups, set down with that brief sound marking pause or finish or both. Then again, certainty is expensive whenever repetition becomes available cheaply. So there are premium services now for expedited clearance into heavily requested personal intervals involving marriages, verdict announcements, contract signings, performances later made famous, mostly because they were revisited, often enough to acquire market value independent of whatever happened first time through. Attention creates scarcity out of abundance by converging too hard on selected hours while leaving whole years untouched, except by their original occupants, who may themselves have lost interest and moved their subscriptions elsewhere after introductory plans expired into standard rates, billed quarterly with archival storage included but cross-linked annotations sold separately. Nobody says miracle anymore in those buildings. They say access tier and custodial chain and authenticated continuity window. They say incidental co-presence when referring to others who happened originally to share an interval, now under review by someone returning alone, under lawful privilege, extended through kinship or contract clause 6, subsection D revised. After appeals, court clarification, issued 12. September 2024 at 9:0116 a.m. A timestamp so exact it starts sounding devotional, despite being generated, mainly so departments could stop arguing over version control. During audits, no member of the public reads voluntarily unless trapped indoors with failing heat and no better option nearby. Still, precision does answer something practical, even when it leaves everything human untouched underneath it. If another person's past can be entered only with leave, then leave must be given somehow visible beyond trust alone. Otherwise, every old conversation becomes vulnerable to dispute over unseen company gathered afterward around words spoken before consent. Procedures existed between participants who never imagined future attendance would need regulating, like building occupancy limits or copyright usage across media formats updated every 5 years, whether necessary or not, just so committees can prove continued relevance through amended definitions attached as appendices. Nobody loves, but everybody cites, once conflict begins moving money around seriously enough. And money does move toward this, very calmly. There are consultants who help families manage legacy windows after a relative authorizes posthumous viewing rights restricted by mood category and duration cap, per quarter-year equivalent, adjusted seasonally for demand, forecasting models developed first for tourism, then repurposed without shame toward remembrance markets, where nostalgia packages bundle legal review with scheduling assistance, plus optional transcript, indexing searchable by keyword if subscribers prefer not actually returning, until selecting promising segments worth full experiential attendance later on, slower evenings when bandwidth fees drop after 10. That last part almost says everything worth saying about people without saying much new at all. Given endless return within certain bounds, many do not go back more deeply than convenience allows. They skim themselves efficiently through licensed interfaces prepared by firms insisting this saves emotional wear while somehow charging extra for uncompressed presence, should anyone want raw duration instead of curated highlights, extracted from life already completed once in real time under conditions, less organized, and probably more honest, simply because no menu hovered nearby, offering chapter markers such as first meeting, revised understanding, final ordinary breakfast before promotion. News pending confirmation archive. Ready soon. The menus arrive wherever repetition settles long enough. Nobody questions them for long. Yet behind all these systems sits a plain, stubborn fact. No filing cabinet improves. Going back does not restore membership in what is being watched. A permit may authorize attendance down to the minute. Identification may confirm rightful access beyond challenge. Seals may certify respectful conduct according to current standards drafted after several embarrassing cases involving excessive repeat observation during private celebrations deemed legally harmless but socially parasitic. Under etiquette revisions circulated widely each spring beside reminders about silent posture expectations and recommended maximum dwell times per emotionally concentrated interval. None of that answers who exactly arrives there. Not really. Is sanctioned witnesshood still presence if the moment owes nothing back? The question stays awkward inside official language because official language prefers roles cleanly bounded: applicant, subject, observer, secondary party with limited review rights. Pending approval outcome within 10 business days, excluding transit delays between archival branches currently operating under reduced staffing due to modernization works promised since 2019, and visible mainly as plastic sheeting taped badly over doorways beside signs, thanking visitors for patience while nothing obvious improves, except perhaps toner allocation efficiency, according to annual reports printed beautifully on paper, heavier than common sense would recommend. Forms multiply fastest where uncertainty cannot be removed. That seems true beyond offices, too. So another request gets stamped, received at 11,043. The received by whom becomes blurred almost immediately into process rather than person. Another drawer closes. Another notation marks duplicate interest in an hour already claimed several times this month by different relations, each asserting reasons impossible, either to rank fairly or dismiss entirely. Another chair scrapes somewhere behind a partition where interviews determine whether curiosity counts as sufficient cause, when affection cannot be proven cleanly on documents surviving from years nobody expected would need. Preserving quite so thoroughly down to receipts stained faint brown from tea rings, dried into fibers long before their evidentiary potential became billable service categories, offered online with cheerful icons, designed far above appropriate mood level for such work. And then, where does leaving stand once return requires booking reference numbers. Perhaps that is why even here some moments remain unfiled longer than they could be kept, unfiled technically speaking. Not hidden, exactly. Just left alone out of manners toward whatever happened there before. Administration arrived, carrying folders sturdy enough to make anything seem manageable, provided each page has margins wide enough for initials next to boxes marked complete. Pending final confirmation, unavailable at present due to backlog conditions, sincerely regretted by management, committed always to improving your experience with irreversible time through streamlined services beginning next quarter, unless deferred again. The language tries hard. Reality lets it try. That leaves the older self in an odd position. Not important in the legal sense, because the law had to decide long ago that continuity counts for paperwork, or nothing could be signed, inherited, married, fined, or buried with any confidence at all. Important in the private sense. The version that sat there once, elbow near the table edge, not yet knowing it would ever be watched again by its own later attention, is both fully oneself and no longer available as oneself now. The gap is small on paper, and enormous, in fact. A cup can make that plain. Not because it contains wisdom. It just sits there with its hairline split descending from the rim, and the hand that once closed around it belongs to a body already completed in that minute. Later attendance does not slide back into that grip. It only arrives beside it, silent and informed too late. That may be the strangest ordinary thing here. Knowledge returns where participation cannot. So, when people speak about visiting their own past, they often use possessive words too confidently. My afternoon. My conversation. My seat by the window. The grammar holds because grammar is built for speed, not precision. But ownership starts to loosen under repeated return. After enough revisits, a former hour begins to resemble property held jointly with a stranger who happens to have had one's face at the time, and one's habits down to small things no one else would notice, such as tapping once against ceramic before drinking if the liquid was hotter than expected. The stranger is not false. That would be easier. It would simplify matters if earlier selves could be treated as drafts leading neatly toward a finished person who now reviews them from superior distance, but nothing behaves so kindly. The one being observed was complete while existing. Full authority, then. Full confusion, too, perhaps. But confusion does not reduce reality. It only changes how reality was met. Later insight has no right of revision over that completed presence. It can stand nearby with better language and poorer access, which is a humiliating arrangement when stated plainly enough. There are services built around softening that humiliation without naming it as such. Counselors trained in self-revisit preparation advise against phrases suggesting correction or rescue, even in private notes submitted before extended observation periods. Pamphlets recommend neutral framing for encounters with prior versions of oneself. Etiquette seminars remind attendees that disappointment upon discovering one's past self was less considered than remembered, is common and should not be projected backward through contemptuous posture during witness sessions visible to others, sharing adjacent temporal access lanes separated by frosted partitions installed after complaints about judgmental. Lingering became too frequent to ignore politely. All very sensible. And still, none of it settles what exactly is being met when attention returns to an hour one used to call lived experience without qualification. Is it memory given walls and furniture again, or contact with someone left behind through no fault except time passing in its usual way? The world treats these as practical distinctions only when billing requires different categories of service, yet inwardly, they do not stay practical for long. A chair says something about this too, though less neatly than forms do, and more honestly than counseling brochures manage. The wood bears pressure where bodies have settled into it over years. One front leg has worn the floor slightly brighter where it drags before finding balance. There is often a faint scrape before stillness when weight commits itself fully. Return happens around such details rather than above them. The earlier self trusted that chair without noticing trust at all. The later self notices everything because noticing is almost all that remains available. That difference matters more than people admit in public speech about growth. Growth suggests continuity with improvement attached, as though time were mainly an editing process carried out on one staple subject from youth onward, by means of mistakes eventually redeemed into wisdom, presentable enough for speeches or anniversary cards or institutional campaigns, encouraging responsible revisit practices among citizens aged 16 and above, pending guardian consent where applicable under current domestic statutes, revised after several famous disputes. Nobody remembers accurately except through archived footage, repeatedly consulted by commentators whose livelihoods depend on sounding definitive about events made less simple each time they are watched again, by those who were actually there. Sometimes later life does not feel like improved continuity at all. Sometimes it feels like becoming successive witnesses to former occupants of one's own name. That sounds severe until placed beside common experience here, where recognition often arrives first through embarrassment over some tiny habit preserved intact. Inside an old minute, the way fingers worried at a paper sleeve around a cup without purpose, or how shoulders lifted before speaking difficult sentences never delivered half as well as memory had promised, afterward for years. Such moments are trivial and final together. No grand revelation is needed. Identity loosens most convincingly through small evidence. Then affection becomes complicated in useful ways. If the earlier self begins to look partly other, ridicule loses some of its force because ridicule aimed backward lands on someone who can no longer answer, but did once bear full weather from inside conditions. Later observers understand only selectively, despite superior hindsight and access to records unavailable, then at point of living decision under review. Now for perhaps the 9th time this season, depending on personal appetite for reinspection, mistaken publicly for courage whenever repetition can be narrated attractively enough, for friends who prefer stories of closure over quieter accounts involving uncertainty endured without reward, beyond accuracy, slowly replacing vanity. Accuracy has poor manners sometimes. It refuses flattering simplifications, such as "I was always becoming this exact person," or "I knew more than I let myself know," or even "I should have understood then what seems obvious, now under lamplight, far downstream from consequence with dates labeled plainly, on archive tabs and contextual notes, searchable by keyword across linked domestic records, available premium tier after identity verification succeeds on second attempt, because systems distrust nostalgia almost as much as fraud, and often cannot tell them apart. Efficiently enough for customer satisfaction surveys distributed every quarter regardless. In ordinary rooms, this philosophical trouble looks very plain indeed. A seat pulled back from a table remains turned slightly outward after use. Heat gone from tea leaves. A dark ring near a spoon mark. Dust settles across shelves. Whether anyone comes back 10 times or never again at all. Matter does not cooperate with personal myth beyond offering traces dense enough to provoke it endlessly. Perhaps that is why revisiting one's own past can feel less like reclaiming life than requesting audience with prior tenancy. The request is always granted automatically when directed inward within lawful limits of duration and health advisories concerning excessive recursive exposure, issued each winter alongside recommendations for sleep hygiene, after intensive historical attendance blocks exceeding approved thresholds per week, unless exempted professionally or medically certified under standards updated so often. Few read them closely until headaches begin appearing during breakfast accompanied by mild dissociation, widely considered manageable if inconvenient, according to official guidance written in tones meant to reassure while avoiding liability language too nakedly visible between lines. Even automatic permission does not create intimacy, though. There remains this quiet shock. The person there did not know they were already, someone else eventually looking back. And yet, they were. Both statements hold without helping much. So what separates recollection from actual return may be less vividness than resistance. Memory yields. The past itself does not. An old room keeps its distances. An older self keeps them too. That may be why some come away gentler after repeated visits. Others become harsher first and gentler much later, if at all. They discover they cannot merge cleanly with what preceded them. They can only accompany it briefly, under rules stricter than love usually expects from itself. The unfinished records sit there, laid open timestamp by timestamp beneath institutional lighting. The lighting was chosen specifically to prevent eye strain. Yet it produces another kind of strain. No design committee has managed to solve it, despite years of quarterly consultation invoices filed under innovation initiatives. And then another question presses close behind all this, without improving clarity. If one stands beside a former version often enough, at what point does present identity start borrowing more substance from observation than from direct living? There are people known chiefly for their diligence toward previous decades of themselves, admired in certain circles for archival stamina bordering on vocation, able to cite gestures made 20 years apart within seconds, while current appointments drift unattended past. Due dates noted sternly by administrators who have seen this pattern often enough to code special flags into scheduling software, meant kindly, but received otherwise. No rule forbids devotion to one's own trail. No rule says how much company an abandoned self may reasonably expect either. That uncertainty stays open. A life becomes crowded here without gaining more events. The same afternoon can contain its original inhabitant, plus many later loyalties arranged around that first unknowing presence whose claim remains primary, precisely because nothing done afterward can alter what was done then. Perhaps identity survives by accepting rank order rather than unity. Perhaps not. The chair remains worn where weight found it before thought arrived, naming any of this. That seems worth keeping in mind whenever return starts sounding too much like possession. Which brings the attention back to furniture, because furniture keeps score in a way memory does not. A chair does not care who has returned to regard it. Its legs still press the same marks into the floorboards, and the front edge of the seat still carries that slight polish where hands have steadied themselves before sitting down or getting up, years apart, and somehow also all at once. The scrape matters here. That brief drag of wood or metal over floor is one of the small sounds that became charged once return grew ordinary, because it means readiness before it means rest. A chair pulled out is a place made available, but in this world, availability has layers. The seat may be empty in the present room and occupied elsewhere by an earlier version preserved in its own hour, and so people learn to glance at chairs with a strange courtesy, not to determine whether they are free exactly, but to ask free for whom. Some rooms are built around that hesitation, without ever admitting it openly. The single chair set near a blank wall, the second chair folded flat against the corner. Because too much accommodation encourages lingering, the felt pads fixed under each leg, so repeated adjustments do not scar the boards beyond repair. There are manuals about posture during revisits, though naturally they avoid calling them manuals, and prefer guidance notes on bodily ease during temporal attendance sessions, as if softer wording could hide what is being regulated. Even here, bureaucracy reaches down to knees and lower backs. Sit upright, but not rigid. Keep both feet grounded when possible. If dizziness begins, end session. The human body became another office-needing procedure once it was asked to remain calm while sharing space with what had already happened. And yet the chair itself stays plain. That plainness is part of why attention keeps settling there. No machine announces anything through it. No glow gathers around its frame. It is just a weight-bearing object, waiting under ordinary light, carrying one body at a time in practical terms, while carrying many more in thought than any carpenter intended when joining seat to backrest with screws meant for simpler burdens. There is tenderness in worn furniture because where records repetition without opinion, the top rail grows smoother where fingers have rested behind the neck for years. One rung near the floor dulls first where shoes hook absent-mindedly. One leg acquires a tiny looseness that only appears when weight shifts sideways at a certain angle, familiar enough that returning visitors brace for it before it happens, though nothing can be altered by such anticipation. That may be one reason old chairs survive longer than expected here. Despite all their labor, no one wants to replace an object that has learned so much pressure from one exact life. Then again, replacement happens anyway, and that produces its own quiet offense. Not moral offense exactly, more administrative insult than grief. An item deemed unsafe by inspection receives a tag on string looped through a spindle or armrest, dates stamped neatly in blue ink, removal authorized pending review if associated. Revisit demand exceeds structural confidence ratings established after several publicized collapses, embarrassed municipal insurers into action years ago. It is hard not to notice how quickly concern for continuity becomes. Risk management language once forms are involved. A person may feel bound to an old seat because some earlier self sat there on some afternoon, now revisited every autumn. Facility sees load history, plus maintenance backlog, plus liability exposure, if sentiment proves heavier than timber. Still, even new chairs begin taking on old obligations immediately. The floor shows this first. Around frequently revisited positions, there are shallow arcs where legs have been nudged back over decades by people preparing themselves for return or steadying after coming out of it. Too fast, dust settles differently under seats often left. Half-turned, varnish fades into pale commas beneath points of pressure repeated beyond any original design estimate. Those marks are difficult to romanticize because they look exactly like use, which perhaps is better. Time travel becomes easier to think about when reduced briefly to scuffs near 4 feet of wood. A cup nearby sometimes sharpens this further without trying to help. Not even full now, only cooling residue ringed brown along ceramic walls beneath that fine line descending from rim toward handle base, as if heat had been making private decisions inside clay for years before anyone noticed evidence on the outside surface. Chairs hold weight directly, cups hold intervals more quietly. Set beside each other, they say almost everything needed about return, and none of it comfortingly. How many times can presence settle into one spot before presence starts behaving more like inspection than living? The question comes back whenever attention rests on these prepared seats with their small noises and patient damage. Because sitting down seems simple until repetition gives simplicity, edges sharp enough to catch thought on. In daily practice, nobody speaks this grandly about chairs, of course. They complain about wobble or praise lumbar support, or ask whether felt replacements have arrived from central supply after last quarter's shortage caused absurd delays across 3 districts due to procurement software misclassifying seating components as decorative accessories rather than essential temporal infrastructure requiring priority routing approval from someone who surely never sat through 6 consecutive returns on bare metal while waiting for corrected inventory codes to propagate through departmental systems designed by consultants paid extravagantly to streamline inconvenience into newer inconvenience with cleaner fonts. But bodies know before language catches up. The hand finds the side rail before descent and tests firmness without thinking much about why caution deepened over generations born into revisitation, as routine hygiene for regret and curiosity alike. Thighs measure cold surfaces instantly. Spine learns which angle means endurance rather than comfort, because comfort invites drift, while endurance preserves witness quality across longer intervals when attention must stay steady but unintrusive. Afterward, there is always that slight pause before rising fully clear of the seat, as though some portion of balance remains loaned out between tenses and needs an extra second reclaimed through calves and soles instead of thought alone. A room arranged for return often feels unfinished until a chair settles into place within it, properly squared or deliberately off-center, depending on what kind of past will be attended there most often. That sounds excessive until considering how much depends on minor alignment when nothing else can be touched at all. If intervention is forbidden by nature rather than law, then posture becomes one of the last domains left open for control, which explains more than official literature admits about why seating design meetings run long enough to require refreshments served inevitably in sturdy mugs. No committee member remembers ordering, yet everyone uses, while discussing humane witness conditions, with expressions suggesting civilization itself hangs upon armrest width. Specifications revised, line by line, each fiscal year. Perhaps civilization does hang there more than anyone likes saying plainly. Because what else receives the returning body when return cannot change outcome. Not revelation, usually. Not closure either, despite marketing language from private retreat firms selling curated revisit environments upholstered beyond necessity and scented faintly with cedar under claims unsupported by serious evidence, except customer testimonials written in tones halfway between relief and expensive self-congratulation. More often, it is simply a chair taking weight again, while somewhere else, another version once bore that same person less knowingly through an ordinary hour, whose ordinariness later became worth revisiting, precisely because nothing announced itself then as final enough. That ordinary quality leaves traces finer than drama ever could. Compressed cane webbing repaired twice and sagging still at center point. Screw heads polished bright against darker brackets from repeated tightening, fabric thinned along one front corner where clothing brushed during countless departures, old and new layered together conceptually, if not materially. Even air seems arranged around certain seats differently after long use, though perhaps that last part belongs more to expectation than fact, since air refuses record-keeping better than wood does. Still, there remains something difficult here about arrival, prepared too carefully for a moment, already complete without assistance from any future witness, leaning toward it from another year's patience. Is coming back merely another way of leaving badly finished? The question does not accuse anyone. It sits down where explanation would like to sit instead. And maybe that is why chairs matter more than doors in this world shaped by return without revision. Doors suggest passage accomplished by crossing thresholds once each direction counted cleanly enough. Chairs admit duration instead, attendance measured not by entry, but by staying put beside what cannot notice. Company added later, except indirectly through all these accommodations built around absence, made regular enough to furnish properly. So the worn seat remains persuasive in its quiet way, not mystical, just honest about pressure. It says preparation has mass. It says patience leaves marks. It says even when nothing can be changed, something must still bear the effort of returning there at all. And that is the limit that gives the whole practice its shape. Return is common. Revision is not. The distinction sounds clean when printed on public notices and less clean when it settles into the body, because bodies are built for correction in small ways. A hand half lifting before thought catches it, a mouth preparing the sentence that would fix an old sentence, if only time had left that option open. It never does. Attention may go back as often as patience allows, but the moment itself does not open to negotiation. So regret here has very little theater to work with. It cannot spend itself on fantasies of rescue for long, because rescue is structurally unavailable, and anything structurally unavailable eventually loses some of its pull, no matter how much literature tries to keep it polished. What remains is stranger and quieter, not the wish to alter what happened, since that road closes early, but the wish to stay near it until its edges stop catching on thought every day. That turns revisiting into a discipline more than an adventure. A person returns not to intervene, but to endure accurate contact with what was already complete. There are official phrases for this. They appear on pamphlets in heavy paper folders beside intake desks and beneath framed notices about witness conduct and duration limits during peak request periods. Observe without expectation of effect. Attend without corrective intent. Allow completion to remain complete. It is hard not to admire the effort institutions make here, taking one of the oldest human impulses and reducing it to sentences fit for wall mounting. Hard also not to notice that these sentences exist because people kept discovering, in private and at scale, how difficult it is to sit still before an unchanged fact. The practical instruction underneath all that language is simpler. Nothing needs doing. That sentence gets used carefully because it can sound cruel if delivered too brightly, but within this world it often functions as mercy. Not always at first hearing. Later, perhaps. Since return offers no mechanism for repair, it leaves room for another task entirely, one less dramatic and somehow harder, remaining present while the old moment continues perfectly well without assistance from any later self who has come back full of hindsight and improved manners. What does it mean to sit before an hour that asks nothing now any more than it asked then? The question keeps opening because presence usually flatters itself by attaching value to action. A cup left cooling on a table makes this plain in a way doctrine never manages. The liquid loses heat, whether watched once or 20 times. The thin line running down from the rim does not heal under repeated attention. The small mark where porcelain met wood arrives with its same light clink. Each visit and means exactly what it meant before, which may be almost nothing except that something was set down after being held for a while. Yet almost nothing can become enormous when revisited enough, not because the object changes under scrutiny, but because scrutiny finally admits how little ownership there ever was over passing moments in the first place. That admission supports whole professions now. There are counselors licensed specifically for non-corrective return, who spend long afternoons helping clients distinguish between unfinished feeling and unfinished event, since only one of those can continue after the fact in any meaningful sense. There are insurers who calculate, revisit frequency against workplace function on forms written with such patient neutrality that absurdity becomes almost respectable by typography alone. There are disputes over whether repeated attendance at one old conversation counts as healthy processing or unauthorized dwelling if done during company hours, using employer-subsidized temporal access rooms whose chairs meet regulation depth requirements, but still produce complaints filed quarterly under musculoskeletal strain associated with prolonged historical observation. It would be easy to laugh too sharply at all this organization around helplessness, except helplessness organized calmly may be one of civilization's better achievements when compared with helplessness left raw and private behind closed doors. Besides, people do need structure where temptation runs ahead of reality by habit alone. The temptation is subtle. Once direct alteration has been ruled out by experience rather than theory. It shifts from changing events to extracting from them some final payment and understanding. One more visit might explain why those words were said in that order, or why silence arrived just there, or why leaving happened with so little visible force behind it at the time. One more sitting through could reveal what was missed by being alive inside it instead of observant afterward. One more return might convert confusion into pattern, neat enough to store away properly at last beside all other completed things. And yet many moments resist this service indefinitely while remaining entirely ordinary, tea cooling untouched near a stack of papers, chair legs settling after weightlifts, a bridge rail cold under a hand years apart, but still only metal at a certain hour. Perhaps regret survives best where nothing grand occurred. Large events attract language quickly and get processed by custom, whether sincere or merely available on short notice from culture's supply. Ordinary failures have less help offered them because they look too small from outside, tone mistaken once, attention given elsewhere. Briefly, departure made without knowing. Departure had started already, no alarm, sounding anywhere sufficient to justify permanent storage in memory's front room, until much later when return reveals how quietly decisive some unnoticed minute had been all along. Then, what exactly is being revisited? The event itself, or belated recognition attached afterward? A scrape from a chair answers part of that without meaning to. Not an answer really, more a reminder that matter records pressure differently from thought recording significance. The floor bears faint arcs where legs have shifted again and again into nearly identical positions across years of use by those preparing themselves for pasts. They cannot enter as participants anymore, even when those pasts belong nominally to them alone. Wood accepts repetition without asking motive first. Human minds do nearly the opposite. Motive arrives early, then changes shape each visit anyway. This may be why so many guidelines insist on duration limits, even in private facilities marketed around personal healing, rather than public archive access or family agreements negotiated through legal offices skilled in shared memory permissions law. Endless exposure does not guarantee peace any more than avoidance guarantees forgetting. Some moments thicken under return. Some wear smooth. Most do both unevenly. The strange part is how quickly society learned to speak about acceptance while continuing quietly to sell premium packages built around proximity upgrades. Nobody can justify philosophically, yet plenty can describe administratively. Longer windows inside high-demand dates, adaptive seating calibrated for extended witness sessions, beverage service timed so cups reach ideal warmth just before transfer begins, despite universal knowledge that no drink stays hot enough by session, and unless ignored altogether during viewing hours, meant precisely for attending closely instead of sipping responsibly as recommended by facility policy, printed discreetly near every side table. Humans will monetize patience if patience repeats often enough. That was probably unavoidable. Still, beneath fees and etiquette manuals, there remains something plain enough that even bureaucracy cannot hide it completely. Going back becomes useful exactly where doing becomes impossible. Not pleasant useful necessarily, not efficient, just real. When action drops away, attention stands exposed as labor rather than ornament. To remain with an old scene absent any power over sequence or outcome asks more steadiness than most daily tasks ever require, because daily tasks reward movement immediately, while this offers none beyond continued contact itself. No applause follows accurate witnessing. No revised ending appears as compensation. A moment simply keeps being what it was while another version of awareness sits nearby. Learning late obedience toward fact. And maybe late obedience is too harsh a phrase. Maybe late honesty fits better. Because there is honesty in discovering how much memory edited on its own behalf before revisiting corrected it back toward proportion, how severe tones soften slightly under review, how noble motives shrink, how certain injuries turn out less singular than advertised internally across years of solitary recollection, how some embarrassments remain exactly as painful as remembered, except smaller in scale than their long tenancy suggested. Return can humble pain without erasing it. It can also confirm pain where denial had been doing cheap renovation work over unstable ground. Both happen. Neither grants control. So regret becomes less about undoing than about consenting finally to exactness. Though consent may take dozens of visits spaced over months because exactness lands slowly when cherished self. Misreadings must be laid down one by one beside whatever actually occurred. And then another question starts pressing against the first one. If an hour goes on needing nothing from whoever comes back later, full of clearer sight, where exactly does present attention belong? Is returning only another form of standing beside one's own departure after calling it reflection long enough? The thought does not settle neatly because presence here has never stayed obediently inside one tense despite regulations pretending otherwise for scheduling purposes alone. A cracked cup waiting out its own coolness knows something about this without knowing anything at all. It holds what was poured until holding ends. Watching longer does not reheat it. Perhaps that is why revisiting sometimes teaches patience better than forgiveness or insight or closure ever could manage under brighter names offered too soon across reception counters and wellness brochures alike. Patience with fact. Patience with sequence. Patience with having been there once insufficiently aware and coming back unable to improve performance except by seeing plainly now what plainness looked like then. That seems modest written down. In practice, it can occupy years quite fully. And still the old difficulty remains nearby, calm as furniture, when someone returns again and again to an hour already finished without them long ago. Has presence been renewed, or merely prolonged past its proper boundary? Nothing in this world forbids asking that quietly, and nothing answers fast enough to close it either. Perhaps that is why the smallest things keep holding the thought better than the large ones do. Not monuments, not anniversaries, not the grand language printed on pamphlets about reflective return. A chair with its weight settled into the floor. A cup left after heat has gone. The ordinary objects are honest because they do not pretend anything has reopened. The ceramic does not care how many times attention comes back to hover near the hour in which it was filled. The thin line running down from the rim remains only a line in fired clay, neither deepened by sentiment nor repaired by understanding. It sat there during the first drinking and sits there still under later witness, and that plain endurance says something. Memory rarely says on its own that a moment can remain available without becoming alive again in the way longing keeps proposing. That distinction matters here more than people admit publicly. The approved language prefers softer terms. Reconnection. Revisitation wellness. Continuing presence services, if an office needs to justify its budget before quarter's end. But most of the real work happens under less flattering names. Waiting rooms for access clearance. Notices about restricted overlap hours when too many claims have been placed on one afternoon. Quiet reminders posted beside archive desks that extended attendance does not confer interpretive priority, which is a very formal way to tell someone that staring longer at old events does not make their version truer than anyone else's. It is hard not to admire that sentence a little. Humans will always draft policy where mystery begins repeating itself often enough. And repetition is really what changes everything here. Not travel itself, because travel suggests distance crossed once with some consequence attached to arrival. This is closer to recurrence under rules so familiar they stop feeling impossible until thought catches up again and asks what sort of life accepts this without collapsing under self-surveillance or nostalgia or simple exhaustion. Yet most days do not collapse at all. Most days absorb it in small ways. A pause before speaking, because this exchange may be watched later by the speaker who has not yet learned what was being said while saying it. A table reserved, though no body in this present minute seems to require it. The faint scrape of a chair being drawn back somewhere for an absence with legal standing. That sound means preparation here. It also means surrender more often than anyone likes to say. Because returning without power over sequence strips away many of the fantasies usually attached to second chances and leaves something barer behind. Consent to sit near completed fact long enough for resistance to tire itself out properly, rather than merely changing style and calling itself insight. There is no shortage of people willing to market this process as growth, with appointment slots available at convenient intervals. But stripped of brochures, it remains stubbornly plain. Nothing asks for intervention from the later witness. Nothing can be rescued into better timing or sharper speech after the event has already spent itself once entirely without assistance from hindsight. So what continues when attendance continues after use has ended? That question keeps opening under smaller questions and making room beneath them. A room with one chair can hold it easily enough. So can a bridge rail worn smooth where hands have returned across years to rest in nearly the same place, while below them, water keeps moving through its own present untouched by any permit system above it. The crossing happened once, and then again in recollection, and then again in direct revisit, and still somehow refuses either multiplication or reduction. Cleanly, it remains one crossing burdened by many acts of witness. Unless burdened is wrong, unless repeated regard thins an hour instead of thickening it, rubbing certainty off its edges while leaving sequence intact. The world never answers which of those occurs. It simply allows both suspicions to live side by side for as long as thought wants company. There is comfort in that, though comfort may be too warm a word for something so exacting. Better perhaps to call it steadiness. A moment does not require defense against later looking, because later looking cannot enter its machinery deeply enough to alter operation, even when emotion insists otherwise for years at a time. Morning remained. Morning on whatever day gets revisited most often. Words landed when they landed. Silence occupied its measured span. Liquid cooled inside porcelain, whether anyone appreciated that cooling fully or failed at it altogether before setting the vessel down with that small final contact against wood or stone or laminate. The clink ends nothing by itself. Still, endings gather around such sounds. And maybe that is part of what makes revisiting so difficult to name. Honestly, departure turns out not to happen once either. There was leaving when the hour first passed beyond immediate use, and then other leavings hidden inside each return, when attention withdraws again, having gained accuracy, perhaps, but no ownership worth mentioning. To come back is also to go away, another time from something unable to notice either movement. That feels almost rude when stated plainly, though rudeness enters mostly because human feeling wants reciprocity from occasions built without any obligation to provide it. What is presence worth if what receives it goes on complete without asking? There are businesses built around answering that too quickly, naturally enough. Certificates can be purchased, attesting that a revisit reached meaningful depth according to recognized reflective metrics developed by committees whose members no doubt believed they were helping bring dignity where chaos might otherwise spread unchecked across public institutions already overworked. Handling access disputes between relatives, former partners, co-witnesses of shared vacations, now somehow administratively contested decades later because everyone remembers sunlight differently. Until timestamps force humility upon them all at once, through official review windows open Tuesdays through Fridays, except civic holidays. Even absurdity acquires office hours. Especially absurdity that recurs reliably enough for funding requests. Still, beneath all that filing and polite language, there remains this quieter matter of bodily knowledge that no form captures well, How strange it is for awareness to settle near an earlier version of itself and find neither reunion nor separation a sufficient description. Not reunion, because nothing joins back together exactly. Sequence forbids that much kindness or confusion depending on mood. Not separation either, because recognition persists too strongly when an old gesture appears with painful familiarity intact in wrist angle, or breath timing, or some tiny hesitation before speech begins. A self can become historical without becoming foreign. That seems important. It also seems unfinished as thoughts go. The worn seat says something similar without intending speech at all. Pressure leaves traces slowly, even when each sitting counts as ordinary at the time. Polish along one edge where fabric rubbed year after year, one leg slightly louder against floorboards than the others. Because weight favored one side more often than balance would recommend, if balance had ever been consulted about human habits, honestly enough, beforehand. Furniture records repetition better than memory records proportion. That may be why attention keeps dropping there. An object need not understand duration to show where duration has been leaning. And then there is the past tense itself, still behaving badly under close inspection despite generations spent living with these conditions as calmly as weather reports suggest they should be lived with. Grammar promises order where experience offers overlap instead, had been there, am there now again, was present. Then insufficiently, perhaps, but present nonetheless, have since returned often enough that simple verbs start fraying under administrative demand placed upon them every day in schools and courts and cafes full of tables occupied partly by chronology, rather than bodies visible from this minute alone. Language copes. Coping is not clarity. Nobody expects clarity anymore from tenses used heavily enough against impossible facts. Perhaps endings are affected most quietly by all this. An evening does not quite close just because clocks advance beyond it, if attention may lawfully settle back into its open portions, tomorrow or next winter, or 20 years later, after fashions change and buildings are repainted around, unchanged intervals waiting inside personal history with unreasonable patience. Yet neither does availability cancel completion. This double condition sits everywhere here unnoticed, until noticed suddenly, done and reachable, over and enterable, absent from current use, but still capable of hosting fresh observation from those who belong there, by memory or paperwork, or both, depending on whose signature was required after family disagreement hardened into procedure. Such sentences sound cumbersome, because reality became cumbersome first. People adapted anyway. They always do. So perhaps the old question stays, because every simpler version lies a little about what return accomplishes. If awareness comes back where life has already moved on without needing escort from hindsight, has anything like presence begun anew, or has departure merely learned how to linger respectfully past its first occasion? The mind turns that over and finds no clean edge on it anywhere worth trusting completely. The cup remains where cooling finished long ago. And whatever being there means, once leaving has already happened, does not grow clearer by force tonight. It only grows quieter for having been held a while longer without demand for answer.